Hey there, Jason here with Renaissance Astro Quest, helping you on your quest to understand Renaissance astrology. First of all, Renaissance astrology is comprising the latter period of what is called Traditional Astrology. That's generally considered Hellenistic, medieval, and then of course Renaissance astrology, sources from 1700 AD backwards, and then anything from 1700 AD after would generally be considered modern astrology for these purposes. When we're talking about Renaissance astrology specifically, and that's where we're going to be putting our focus on, because that's, in my opinion, where we find the greatest wealth of writings and practice and explanations and methodologies and logic and cosmology, and the most overall refinement to the art itself, while still maintaining true to those ancient practices that were tried and true and were able to do things such as allow Bonatti to predict and prevent the assassination of an emperor, as well as William Lilly being able to predict the Great Fire of London, just to name two very notable examples of the many examples of ancient astrology proving its efficacy over time. And that is why we choose to focus on Renaissance astrology, myself and other contemporary Renaissance astrologers specifically. So, in understanding Renaissance astrology, we first need to understand the Renaissance World View. This is going to encompass a bit of their philosophy, their spirituality, and their cosmology, because this plays an integral role in understanding how they approached astrology. The methodology and the logic that was used for it will make a lot more sense if you understand how the world functioned in their worldview, and you'll also probably find a great deal of spiritual fulfillment and a lot of practical application to applying that worldview in the modern world. At least I know I have. So in understanding the Renaissance, specifically Elizabethan World View, we're going to start off with the concept of the spheres. So in the Renaissance Elizabethan World View, they divided existence into various spheres or realms of being where different things happened, eventually trickling down to us in the material world. And that's where astrology comes in, of course. By understanding how these spheres work, we're then able to understand the energies influencing us and how best to work with those things to achieve the best results in our lives. So the first of these we're going to look at is the Empyrean, and it's not so much a sphere itself, but rather it is the overall layout of existence that the spheres live inside of. The Empyrean could be considered what the Christian Bible would call the third heaven in some cases, or God's domain. This would be where you read about God's throne being, for example, in the Christian Bible. That would be Empyrean. That's where God lives. That's God's domain. That is the realm of the purely spiritual. You could also look at this from a Hindu example. You could take it as if you removed all of the Maya, all of the material illusions, what you're left with would be the Empyrean, the spiritual reality underneath all of these material things that we see. The Empyrean exists outside, but also permeates within and throughout all of the other spheres in various ways. And again, that's where astrology becomes important, is understanding how the Empyrean seeps through the various spheres. So then the next sphere we're going to see would be the primum mobile, or as the Christian Bible may call it, the Holy Spirit. This is the first mover or the prime mover. This is an entity, an aspect of God or an aspect of the Tao or Brahman or whatever term that you may prefer, the universe itself, if you simply prefer that terminology, that actually puts divine energy into motion, actually setting it forward toward the material world. That is what lies right between the Empyrean, between God, and between the spheres that start breaking down into the material, specifically between the purely heavenly or spiritual spheres, as Cornelius Agrippa would refer to them in 3 books of occult philosophy, and between the celestial spheres, which again would be a terminology you see Agrippa use. Al-kindi also uses this, and De Radi Stellarum. So the primum mobile exists as the sort of bridge between the heavenly, the purely spiritual, and the celestial itself being a bridge between the heavenly and the physical. The primum mobile, the Holy Spirit, whatever term you prefer, setting divine energies into motion, eventually leading to the physical world. So that leads us to the celestial spheres. The first of those we're going to see, the one closest to heaven, closest to the spiritual, is the realm of the fixed stars. This is going to include, obviously, the fixed stars that we're aware of, such as Spica or Algol or Regulus or any of those sort of fixed stars. Also, a little side note for you here, in traditional astrology, that would include Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Those would be considered fixed stars as well for the purposes of traditional astrology methodology. Now, this also includes the constellations. So the 12 signs of the zodiac are also considered to be in the realm of the fixed stars. Picatrix says of the fixed stars that they are of a more permanent influence than the planets, that whatever they do, it may be more subtle, it may be harder to notice, but it is much longer lasting, it is much more permanent in whatever their effects may be. This is also mirrored by Cornelius Agrippa, again in 3 Books of Occult Philosophy. He very much says the same sort of thing, that they have a very lasting influence on things. And that's why we see such an emphasis placed on the zodiac signs in astrology, that we look at the signs first to see the very first impact of divine energies, of heavenly forces into the celestial. As they begin their transition into the physical, they first pass through the fixed stars. And these spheres, all of them, from the fixed stars on down to the rest that we'll be talking about, you can think of those, and the Elizabethans actually viewed them in this way in some of their poetry, as a million pieces of stained glass, if you want to put it that way. That as you have this heavenly light shining downward toward us here on earth, they will pass through these various spheres and be refracted and reflected and colored in various ways that will influence the way the light ultimately looks and behaves and what direction it's going when it comes to us here on earth. The first of that being the fixed stars, where we find the most lasting yet subtle influences being placed. So that's why you'd see in modern astrology the sun sign, moon sign, and rising sign having the emphasis that they do. And that's why even in traditional astrology, you'll see a huge emphasis placed on the zodiac signs in terms of house rulership, or in terms of what planet is placed in what signs and what different significations you can take away from that. That's why you see that influence, because the fixed star realm is where we find the very first shaping of heavenly forces into physical forces. That's where they get their first bit of framing and the most permanent influences that they'll face. So from there, we'll move on to the realm of Saturn. Saturn is considered to be the slowest of the planets. This is going to represent itself in many different ways. Generally, anything Saturn related is going to be slower to manifest itself, but also it is going to be extremely powerful in whatever manifestations that it does have. While it'll take them longer to get there, it won't necessarily be subtle, more subtle than the other planets, but it'll still be very noticeable and very powerful in whatever it does. Saturn is considered the sphere where things actually begin to get their boundaries and their form and their shape. So, for example, if we wanted to use a natal chart and we wanted to use a human as an example for this, our soul has been directed by the prima mobile sit into the celestial spheres, is first hit the realm of the fixed stars, where it may have a conjunction with Spica or Regulus or something like that, and it is also hit one of the zodiac signs and pass through there, where it is getting some sort of permanent influence based on that sign. And then next it hits Saturn. Saturn begins applying boundaries to it, and we're going to find this being reflected very much in a lot of the older texts. Pre-Renaissance, we're going to look a lot more into the medieval texts to find these sort of references to Saturn. Picatrix, Key of Solomon, those are 2 examples where we'll find these traits of Saturn. And Saturn deals a lot more with the spiritual things, with spirits directly, or ghosts, or any of that sort of thing, and also with protection and boundaries, or the rejecting or drawing away of things from ourselves. Those are things that we'd find associated with Saturn, and that's again encompassed by Saturn being that outermost sphere among the planets, that it is there setting up our boundaries. It's setting up what divides us from everything else, where we were once part of the Tao, part of the Brahman, just a piece of Atman, or a part of God, again, whatever term you prefer. Saturn forms the initial outline of our identity, being influenced by the fixed stars. Saturn then sets out to cut out a particular shape for us. Saturn then moves us onward to the sphere of Jupiter. Jupiter is the sphere of increase, of drawing things in. Now that we've been separated and we've been distinguished as our own individual with our own identity, we then enter into the sphere of Jupiter, where we are given things that we are needed. We are given certain traits. certain personality, certain increase to ourselves. Things are drawn in, things are built up. That's why you'll find Jupiter being associated with prosperity, with peace, with love, with joy, with those sort of qualities, because that's the point where personality really begins to shape and form itself, is in that sphere of Jupiter. From there, we move on to the sphere of Mars. Mars, of course, associated greatly with drive and ambition and instinct and, those sort of more masculine and driven, assertive qualities that we would associate ourselves with. Making sense, because now that we have our boundaries, we have our distinct identity, and we've been given a personality, we've been given a more specific form to ourselves. Now we're giving drive and ambition. We're actually given the motivation to apply these things that we've been given. Then we move on down to the sun. The sun representing success and royalty and glory, among other things, but those are very specific things that we'll find represented by the sun. And in this case, we find that now that we have our identity, we have our personality, we have the drive to be applying these things, now we are actually being given our role. We are being given the authority to enact these things that we want to. And this way you could think of it very much like someone who's a prince getting ready to accept the role of being king, about to be crowned as king. They have the drive, they have the personality, they have the lineage to do it. Now they're actually receiving the crown, the authority to move forward and do it. And then that leads us into the sphere of Venus, and that is associated with relationships, any kind of interpersonal contact, with love, of course, and pleasure. Those are things very specifically Venus in nature. And that makes sense. Now we've been set forth to actually enact our role in the universe, that we're to be ourselves, the individual reflection of God that we've been designed to be. Now, how do we use that for the benefit of others? How are we meant to interact with the others? That's going to be something determined by our passage through the sphere of Venus. That leads us to Mercury. In Mercury, we find the work of the mind, the work of communication, of knowledge, of gaining knowledge, and of technology or any sort of innovation. And again, that makes sense, because now that we know who we are, we know what we're supposed to be doing and how that's supposed to be having an effect and benefit for others. Now we start learning how to actually apply it, how to actually make the innovations, and how to actually accomplish the things that we're supposed to do in this world. That leads us to the moon having a great deal of association with the mind, emotions in particular, but also with manifestations. The moon in traditional terms being considered the wandering womb. For example, because the moon gives birth to all things, the moon existing right before we enter into the physical realm, what is generally referred to in traditional astrology as the sublunar realm. For this reason, everything that comes from heaven ultimately is birthed through the sphere of the moon. That is where it actually manifests into the physical world. So likewise for us, we pass through the moon, and that is where our manifestation, where our life actually begins here on this earth. And again, we're just using the example of a soul traveling through. This would apply for anything. This would apply for an idea. This would apply for any sort of miracle that you may be praying for, or that you may be performing mantras for or meditating on. This could be simply if you look at a transit and you see what sort of things are happening in your area at that particular time and what sort of celestial influences are at work. For example, Mercury retrograde, it's going to apply there as well. The influences of that Mercury retrograde and what it's going to do with your communications, or what it's going to do with your computer glitching out on you, or whatever may be the case, that actually manifested through the sphere of the moon. That's where it went from simply being a concept to actually existing. And that's another important thing if we want to take a step back and kind of generalize this. When we talk about the Empyrean and the Prima Mobile and the heavenly realm, we're talking about ideas. And this way, everything is so spiritual that it does not exist in a way that we would generally perceive existence. Everything exists as an idea. For example, if we wanted to use the idea of fatherhood, that idea exists in the Empyrean as an idea only. Then in the celestial realm, it becomes a concept. It begins getting more specific definition, more specific form. Then in the physical sublunar realm, you have individual fathers who all in some way or another represent that divine idea of fatherhood. You apply the same thing to mothers and motherhood, or to justice and judges and justice systems, or even to wealth or commerce or currency, even to a horse or a dog. There is a divine idea of what horse is or what dog is, and then there's a celestial concept of what those things are that eventually is manifest into the physical representations of those things. So then, once we have passed through the realm of the moon into the sublunar, we then will find the elements. First would be fire, which is considered the most spiritual element, then air, then water, and then earth being the most physical of the elements. Now, the elements exist underneath moon, leading down to earth, where earth, of course, is comprised of earth element. But they also exist all the way from Empyrean throughout the celestial sphere all the way through. They coexist, and they very much are their own set of spheres. And when we talk about the chain of being here in just a moment, that'll make a little bit more sense. But for just a moment, talking about those elements, it's very important to understand that, because you will find a lot in traditional astrology that there are elements and humors assigned to the zodiac signs and to the planets. Some are more hot and dry. They're more choleric. Some are more cold and dry. They're melancholic. Some are of a fire element. Some are of an earth element, what have you. That gives you an idea of what nature that planet or that sign represents. Fire, as we said, being the most spiritual, the most close to the divine in its nature, the most removed from material concerns, while earth being the most material in nature. For this reason, you would find in Hebrews chapter 12 of the Christian Bible, our God is a consuming fire. That may not make a great deal of sense contextually until you consider that Elizabethan Renaissance World View and that traditional astrological way of viewing the concept of fire spiritually. In that way, it makes a lot of sense to say our God is a consuming fire. That is to say, our God is the most spiritual of beings, completely removed from the material and the physical. Such limitations simply do not apply to him. Again, relating to the chain of being, which we'll talk about in just a moment, that's also asserting God's place at the top of the chain of being. And again, I say God, you can also say Brahman, you can say Vishnu, you can say Tao, or the universe, whatever term you prefer. It's going to apply the same either way. So, having discussed the spheres very briefly, now we're going to move on to the chain of being. This is a concept closely tied into that everything in existence exists in a specific chain as specific links in the chain. We start, as we said, with our God is a consuming fire, the most spiritual of all things, being God, at the very top of the chain. And then everything goes down from there, getting more and more physical and material and less spiritual as it goes down. So from there, we would have the various angels, and you're going to have classes of angels. Those are generally broken up. Generally, you're looking at 7 to 10 different classifications. It depends on exactly what source you're looking at to find those classifications. But again, if we're talking about context of Christian Bible, Romans chapter 8 is one of at least 3 different examples where you'll find terms like principalities, powers, and dominions mentioned. That would be a reference to the chain of being, where those are names of different classes or links of chains for angels, where different angels were classified as being more spiritual, more close to God, more existing as ideas, and then working their way down to being more in form and more conceptual and more actually able to materially act on things. And that's why you will see the Bible often referring to angels, the class of angels, whenever it talks about an angel actually interacting with a human or accomplishing a particular goal in the material world. That would be the lowest class of angels, which are simply called angels. It gets a little confusing there. But the reason for that being that them being the lowest on the chain among the angels means they are more material than the other angels. Hence, they are the ones most able to act on the physical world, which is a very important concept of its own about how each link of the chain has its own unique strengths that separate it from all the other ones. In this case, the lowest ranking angels are most capable of interacting with our world, while the highest ranking ones simply don't really have that capacity. So in that way, they have a superiority even over those higher ranked angels. Below the angels, we would then find humanity. we exist between the angels and animals on the chain. And this makes a great deal of sense because we as humans have the capacity within us to act as either. We can choose to give in to our base desires, our base instincts, and be very much like the animals, just ruled by whatever celestial influence happens to hit us and whatever urge that we may have, and ultimately unable to accomplish very much in life, and a life filled with unnecessary strife and confusion and uncertainty and labor that would not have to be there otherwise. Or we can choose to be more spiritually minded, following into that more Platonic or Neoplatonic way of thinking, that by using reason and rationality, we can seek out truth and we can seek out wisdom. This is something else Al-kindi talks about in De Rati Stellarum, that seeking those hidden things, seeking the unseen things, going beyond the material and looking for spiritual truth, being spiritually minded. Again, we find the Christian Bible talks about this, the Tao talks about this as well, and Hinduism, again, removing the illusion of the material, looking beyond that to the spiritual. By doing this, we can be more divine as beings. We can actually elevate our own status to be more like the angels. And that's why we have that placement in the chain of being, is we have that capacity to be more divine and to accomplish more divine things. As a result, we can find our own lives running much more smoothly. We can find our relationships being much more healthy. We can find ourselves being much more productive, able to do more good things in the world for others. And then, of course, as we said, from there you'd go down to the animals, which are much more material, much less spiritual. They lack the ability for reason at the level that we humans have, and that, of course, limits their capacity to be spiritually minded. Then below them would be the plants, as they're lacking even the basic agency or animation that you would find with an animal. Below them would be your minerals, your rocks, your gemstones, your metals, things like that, as they don't have the ability to grow or change or move at all of their own accord, placing them below the plants in that regard, as they're so much material, so much of earth, that they are completely static. But as we said, each link of the chain does have its own superiority. So if we work our way back up, we'll see that. For example, if we look at the minerals, the rocks, what have you, strength would be the obvious thing they have. Their strength and their endurance. You can look at a piece of metal or a mountain or a boulder, and you can see that it can last for generations upon generations. That we can read texts from 2,000 years ago mentioning a certain mountain as a landmark, and today we can go visit that same landmark, that it has managed to endure, that while it doesn't have any agency or reason or ability to move itself, it has the ability to stay, that is far superior to just about anything else in the chain. Then if we move up to plants, we'll see that their ability to gather nourishment is what the Elizabethans considered to be their greatest strength. That they don't have to go out and hunt for food, they don't have to go pick berries or anything like that. Simply by spreading their branches and their roots, they're able to draw into themselves whatever they need without having to go anywhere to do it. Then, of course, we go up to the animals, and it's pretty obvious what we'll see there, and that is going to be their strength, their agility, their physical prowess, which obviously far exceeds that of most humans. Even something as small as a cat or a squirrel, its agility far exceeds anything that a human would be capable of. Then likewise, if we talk about something like a bear or a gorilla, its physical strength, again, far exceeds what you'd expect of even the highest performing humans. Then we go to humans. So what is our individual strength? What do we have that sets us apart from the other links in the chain? And interestingly enough, it's our imperfection. It is the fact that we are flawed, but we have the ability to grow and improve. That sets us apart even from the angels. The angels, while more perfect in nature than we are, and therefore much less prone to mistake than we are static by nature. They can't learn or grow or change beyond what they are. An angel simply is, and that's all it ever will be. That's all it can be. That is the summation of its existence. But as humans, we can constantly redefine ourselves, and indeed we are encouraged to do so. The Apostle Paul, again, in Christian Bible, very much says this when he says, I die daily. He proposes that sort of concept that every day we should seek to redefine ourselves. We should seek to find in what ways are we flawed, in what ways have we made mistakes, in what ways can we grow beyond those things, learning and improving and being better, more spiritual people. We find this same concept, of course, mirrored in Hermetic philosophy. If we look to alchemy, which is a sister school to astrology, we'll find that same concept there of the constant changing and transformation, of adding and taking away of elements to refine ourselves, the classic philosopher's stone, turning lead into gold sort of thing. That same concept exists there, that we want to improve ourselves, and that is a very basic human drive, and we see that throughout human history. We see that we couldn't be satisfied simply being hunter-gatherers, we couldn't simply be satisfied having tribes, we couldn't just be satisfied developing agriculture. We had to develop entire cities and skyscrapers and automobiles and planes, and even that wasn't enough. We had to devise ways to go out into outer space. Our ability to improve is what makes us superior in the chain of being. And that is extremely important when we're talking about astrology, bringing us back to our primary topic. With astrology, it is very easy to view it in a deterministic sense, that astrology simply tells us what is, and then we just have to deal with that. And that is very much not the case under Renaissance worldview. In the Renaissance Elizabethan way of seeing it, again, that carnal, that physical, material part of ourselves, much like the animals, will be influenced by the celestial. Whatever you see in your natal chart, whatever's going on in a transit, your emotions, your physicality, your instincts, your urges, they are going to be influenced directly by those things, and you will experience that. But your reason, your rationality, your spirituality have the ability, much like angels, again, that's why we're placed between the animals and the angels. We have that ability to strive for higher. Much like angels, we have the capacity within us to take charge over the spheres, the way that the angels are said to have charge over the spheres, over the planets, over the fixed stars. We can take charge over those things, and we can choose, this part of my natal chart says I'm going to be very quick-tempered and ill-tempered. I can choose to resist that. I don't have to be that way. I have the capacity to resist and remove this flaw and improve upon myself as a result. Natal chart says I have an exceptional capacity to memorize things that I read. Well, that can be something I can embrace, and I can make a great effort to read more and to memorize more and to educate myself more as a result. We have the option, whether it's a natal chart or a transit or a horary or whatever we're looking at, to find those things that we find disagreeable, those things that would be a hindrance to us, and we can either avoid those things or we can resist those things and change them while embracing those things that we see to be beneficial to us on our spiritual journey. And that is the key to the Renaissance worldview, is understanding that astrology is not deterministic. It does not decide your fate. It informs your growth. Using astrology, you can learn your template and the template of the world around you, what you need to resist, what you need to avoid, and what you need to embrace to be your best self and live your best life. This is a very, very basic rundown of the Renaissance Elizabethan World View, which will serve as a foundation for our future work in understanding Renaissance astrology. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.